When people talk about leaving a high control religion, they often focus on the relationships that are lost, the family relationships that change, the lifelong friendships that disappear, the isolation that follows. Hi, I'm Rose. I was born as one of Jehovah's Witnesses, and for more than 50 years, I believed I knew exactly who I was, why I was here, what my future would be, and what God expected of me. My beliefs weren't simply part of my life. They were my identity. Then I began asking questions I never expected to ask, not because I wanted to leave, and not because I was looking for reasons to doubt. I simply wanted answers. But once I saw things that I couldn't unsee, I couldn't force myself to unknow them. The foundation that I had built my entire life upon began to crumble. Who was I now? What did I believe? What was true? I was in my late 50s, and for the first time in my life, I didn't know how to answer those questions. I wasn't only questioning doctrines. I was questioning my identity. I found myself considering things that had never crossed my mind before. What do I actually believe? Who am I outside of this organization? What kind of mother do I want to be? Would I celebrate holidays if I were free to choose? Long before my relationships changed on the outside, everything inside of me had already begun to change. At the same time, I was terrified someone would discover what I was learning. I questioned things I knew I wasn't supposed to question. Sometimes I would ask something and then immediately regret it, afraid that someone would recognize what was actually happening inside my mind. To everyone around me, I looked the same, but inside, it felt as though everything I had ever believed was slipping away. And then came the second grief. The people I loved most. My family. My lifelong friends. Relationships that had shaped my entire life began to change in ways that I had never imagined. I found myself grieving two lives at the same time. The life that I was losing and the life I never had the chance to live. In this video, I want to talk about both of those griefs because I don't think we talk about what it feels like to lose not only the people you love, but also the life that you thought you were going to live. I'm not going to minimize how painful that journey was. There was a time I truly didn't believe I could survive what I was going through. But today, I can say something I never thought I would be able to say. There's hope. Healing doesn't erase the pain, but with time, honest conversations, and the freedom to keep searching wherever the evidence leads, the pain begins to change. You begin to discover parts of yourself you never knew were there. You realize that you're a lot stronger than you ever imagined. I never believed I could endure losing so many of the people that I loved the most. But I did. And in surviving what I once believed was completely impossible, I discovered a strength I never knew I had. One day, almost without even noticing, you realize that although you have lost so much, you haven't lost yourself. And in many ways, you're finally beginning to find yourself. There wasn't one moment when everything changed. It was hundreds of moments. A question I couldn't answer. Something I read that didn't fit what I had always believed. A feeling that something wasn't right, even though I desperately wanted it to be. Leaving my religion was the furthest thing from my mind. I didn't want to stop believing. If someone could have given me convincing answers that made everything fit together, I would have gladly accepted them. I wanted my faith to survive, but the more I learned, the harder it became to ignore what I was seeing. For years, whenever I noticed a red flag or experienced doubt, I responded the way I always been taught. I prayed more. I studied more. And I trusted more. Usually that was enough to quiet that discomfort. But this time was different. The questions wouldn't go away. It was like having a squirrel running around inside my head. My mind never stopped. One thought jumped to another, then another, as I tried desperately to reconcile what I had always believed with what I was now discovering. The questions were there when I woke up. They followed me while I was driving, while I was making dinner, while I was trying to fall asleep. It became impossible to separate everyday life from what was happening inside my head. I remember asking questions I knew I wasn't supposed to ask. Sometimes I regretted them the moment the words left my mouth. Not because I believed the questions were wrong, but because I was afraid. Afraid someone would know what I was thinking. Afraid they would see that I was struggling. Afraid of what might happen if I could no longer hide it. And underneath that fear was guilt. Part of me wondered whether I was failing Jehovah. I had been taught that faithful people trusted the organization. So each question left me wondering, was I disappointing God? I couldn't speak openly to my family. I couldn't confide in my closest friends. The people I most wanted to talk to were the very people I feared losing. So I carried it alone. That isolation was almost as difficult as the questions themselves. I wanted someone who understood, someone who wouldn't be frightened by what I was asking, someone who just got it. But there was no one I felt safe talking to. And for the first time, I started to understand that certainty can be a kind of security, because when that certainty began to disappear, the whole world felt less stable. I no longer knew whether the answers that I had trusted my entire life could still hold. And as those answers began to fall away, another question emerged. If I was no longer certain about what I believed, who was I? The hardest part wasn't simply questioning what I believed. It was no longer knowing who I was without those beliefs. For more than 50 years, my identity had been clearly defined. I was one of Jehovah's Witnesses, an elder's daughter, a pioneer, an elder's wife, a mother raising children inside the organization. Those weren't merely roles that I filled. They shaped how I understood myself. I knew where I belonged. I knew what my future was supposed to look like. I knew what God expected of me. I knew what happened after death. I knew what counted as a meaningful life. And then suddenly, I wasn't sure anymore. And if the organization wasn't everything I had believed it to be, then who was I outside of it? What did I actually believe because I had examined it for myself? What values were truly mine? What kind of Christian did I want to be? I felt as though I had reached my late 50s without ever being given the chance to answer those questions for myself. And that realization was devastating. I wasn't only grieving the loss of certainty, I was grieving the person I had believed myself to be. I was also mourning something I never expected to mourn. The life I never lived. The childhood experiences that I missed. The teenage years shaped by fear of doing the wrong thing. The choices that I never allowed myself to consider. Even as a mother, there were times I wanted my children to participate in activities or enjoy experiences that I wanted to do as a kid, that other children had. But I was afraid of the consequences. Not consequences from God, mind you. Consequences from the people around me. Would we be judged? Would people question our spirituality? Would my children be viewed differently? I sometimes wonder what their childhood might have looked like if I had not been so afraid. I'll never know. And that became another kind of grief. There was a grief for the past, a grief for the person I thought I was, a grief for the future I had imagined since childhood. And because I couldn't speak openly about any of it, I carried those losses by myself. To the people around me, I was still the same woman. But inside, I felt as though I was disappearing. I had no idea then that questioning my beliefs would eventually require me to build an identity of my own. But before that could happen, I had to understand where those questions had truly begun. They began with my children. Looking back, I can clearly see where everything began. It wasn't with a doctrinal disagreement. It wasn't because I wanted to leave my religion. It began when my children stopped attending meetings in their late teens and early 20s. As a mom, I wanted to understand why. I loved my children, and I loved my faith. And those were two parts of my life that I never imagined colliding together. I wasn't trying to prove my children wrong, and I wasn't searching for reasons to question what I had believed for more than 50 years. I wanted to understand what they were seeing that I wasn't. At first, I was very careful about where I looked. I expected the answers would strengthen my faith. I believed there had to be reasonable explanations for the concerns that they were raising. So, I started reading. I started listening. I started asking questions that I had never allowed myself to seriously examine before. And then something unexpected happened. One question led to another. The more I learned, the more I realized there were things that I had never investigated for myself. Not because I was unwilling, but because I had trusted that the answers had already been found for me. I had believed that the people teaching me had examined the difficult questions, considered all of the evidence, and reached the conclusions that I could safely accept. For the first time, I began to wonder whether that trust had prevented me from developing conclusions of my own. There were moments when I wished I had never started looking, because the questions felt dangerous. But when something no longer made sense, I couldn't pretend I had never seen it. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't simply accepting what I had been taught. I was examining it. And that was a profound shift in my thinking. I had spent my life believing that intellectual independence was dangerous. Now I was beginning to understand that examining my beliefs honestly was not rebellion. It was responsibility. I had no idea where those questions would lead. I only knew that I loved my children enough to listen. And that decision would change my life forever. When my children stopped attending meetings, I wanted to understand their concerns. At first, I stayed almost entirely within Watchtower publications. I wanted answers from the organization itself. I wasn't looking for outside criticism. I wanted to understand what our history and teachings actually said. As I went back through older publications, something surprised me. There were teachings I had completely forgotten, teachings I had once believed with absolute certainty, teachings that had quietly changed over the years. Some beliefs had been adjusted. Others had disappeared altogether. Practices I had once accepted as unchangeable were different now. And the more I compared older publications with the newer ones, the more I realized how much had changed during my lifetime. I had lived through those changes without fully recognizing their significance, and that was unsettling for me, because for more than 50 years I believed our teachings were consistent because they came from God. Yet, I was reading the organization's own words and seeing things that I had once regarded as truth had later been revised, softened, or abandoned. I began asking questions that I'd never seriously considered. If these teachings changed, why did they change? How had I forgotten so much of what I once believed? How many adjustments had I accepted without ever stopping to examine them in my life? Why was certainty always required of me when the teachings themselves were not always certain? I wanted the organization to have answers that made sense. More than anything, I wanted to reconcile what I was finding with what I had trusted for most of my life. But there came a point when I understood that I could no longer return to the confidence that I once had. I wasn't asking questions because I was trying to be rebellious. I was asking them because I sincerely wanted answers. I wanted to understand. And for the first time, I was tracing beliefs back to their source instead of accepting the conclusions I had been given. My faith in God remained, but my confidence that the organization always spoke for him was no longer automatic anymore. And that distinction changed everything. I didn't know yet what my faith would eventually look like. I only knew that it would have to become my own. There came a point when I realized something. I wasn't only trying to survive anymore. For a long time, every day had been consumed by loss. I mourned the beliefs that had shaped my entire life. I mourned the relationships that would never be the same anymore. I mourned the future I thought I was going to have. I honestly didn't know whether I would ever feel like myself again. And the hardest part was that I didn't know yet who myself was. For the first time, I had to ask questions many people begin asking when they're teenagers. What do I believe? What traditions matter to me? How do I want to celebrate milestones? What values do I want to build my life around? Who am I outside of the organization that once answered every one of those questions for me? Now, those weren't small questions. They seemed overwhelming to me at the time. I wasn't simply changing religions. I was discovering myself for the very first time. I began noticing things I never allowed myself to explore. Simple things. Watching my children make choices without any fear. Wondering what holidays meant apart from what I had always been taught. Learning that kindness didn't belong to just one religion, and that good people existed everywhere, in all religions. Reading the Bible for myself instead of searching only for what someone else said it meant. Now, little by little, something unexpected happened. The fear that had controlled so much of my life began to loosen its grip. Now, not all at once, because healing doesn't happen that way. There were days that I felt strong, and there were days that I felt as though I had just gone backwards. Sometimes one conversation or a memory brought all the grief rushing back. But over time, those moments became less constant. I began to see that healing wasn't about never feeling pain again. It was about the pain no longer controlling every part of my life. I also began to recognize something in myself I had never known was there. I had survived what I once believed would destroy me. There was a time I believed losing my family, my friends, my certainty, and the life I had always known would be the end of me. But it wasn't. It was the hardest thing I have ever lived through, but I lived through it. And that realization changed something inside of me. I discovered a strength that I didn't know that I even had. Not because I wanted this particular journey, and not because suffering automatically makes someone stronger, but because somehow I kept taking the next step. Even while I was hurting, even while I was grieving, even when I couldn't imagine a future. And perhaps the most surprising part was that I still wanted to help other people, even in the middle of my own pain, I wanted someone else to know that they weren't alone, because I remembered how desperately I had needed someone who understood, someone who could look at me and say, "You're going to be okay." People sometimes ask whether I wish I could go back. There was a time when I would have answered yes, without any hesitation. I wanted my old life back. I wanted my family back. I wanted the certainty I had back. I wanted to wake up from what felt like a nightmare and discover that none of it had really happened. But something unexpected happened along the way. I began discovering a person I had never truly been allowed to become. See, when you're born into a high-control religion, your identity is largely given to you. You aren't only taught what to believe, you're taught who you're supposed to be. The decisions are already made. Who your friends should be, what your future should look like, what goals are acceptable, what questions are dangerous, how you should measure your worth. I never realized how much of my life had been shaped by expectations I had never chosen. Now, for the first time, I had permission to think. Not permission someone else gave me. Permission I finally gave myself. Could I celebrate holidays if I chose? What did birthdays really mean to me? Could I enjoy community events without guilt about being around worldly people? Could I simply be present with other people without wondering whether I'm disappointing God? Some answers surprised me. Some are still evolving, and that's okay. For the first time in my life, I realized I didn't need an immediate answer to every question. Uncertainty no longer had to frighten me. It could simply mean I was still learning. I also began to understand the difference between being told what to think and learning how to think. For most of my life, I accepted conclusions that had been prepared for me. Now, I wanted to examine the evidence myself. I wanted to listen to different perspectives. I wanted to reach conclusions according to my own conscience. That doesn't mean I believe I'm always right. It means I'm willing to reconsider. I'm willing to learn. I'm willing to change my mind when the evidence leads somewhere I didn't expect. That intellectual freedom became an important part of finding myself. I can't change the chapters behind me. I can't recover the childhood or the teenage years that I never had. I can't undo choices made under fear. But I can still write the chapters ahead. And today, I'm often proud of myself. Not because everything is healed, and not because life is always easy, but because I survived what I once believed would destroy me. I hope something I shared might help someone else. I wanted someone else sitting alone, questioning everything, to know they weren't losing their mind. They weren't weak. They weren't bad. They were trying to understand, just like I was. And maybe that's why I'm telling this story now. Looking back, I don't only see what I lost. I see what I found. A voice, a curiosity, a deeper compassion for others, a strength I never knew I possessed, and the freedom to continue searching wherever the evidence and my conscience lead me. I don't have every answer. I probably never will, and that's okay with me. Because for the first time, the beliefs I hold and the choices I make belong to me. And that has been one of the greatest discoveries of this entire journey. When this journey began, I truly believed that I was losing everything. My beliefs, my identity, my family, my friends. The future I had spent my entire life believing would be mine. When you're in the middle of that kind of loss, it's difficult to imagine that life will ever feel normal again. I couldn't imagine it. And to be honest, I wasn't sure that there was another side. There were days I didn't think that I would make it through. The grief felt so overwhelming, and the confusion, it never stopped. I wondered whether I would ever feel like myself again. But what I didn't understand then was that I wasn't simply losing an old life. I was slowly discovering one I had never had the freedom to live. For the first time, I began asking questions that had nothing to do with what someone else expected of me. What do I believe? Who am I outside of the organization? What kind of Christian do I want to be? What kind of mother, grandmother, wife, and friend do I want to become? Those questions were frightening at first, but over time, they actually became freeing. I also came to understand that I wasn't only grieving the life that I had lost. I was grieving the life I had never had. I've wondered what life might have looked like if fear hadn't shaped so many of those decisions. What if I had done something differently? What if I had allowed something I was taught to fear? Would my children's lives have been different? Would mine? I'll never know. And I can't go back and become the child or teenager I might have been. I can't return to my years as a young mother and make every decision differently. For a long time, I mourned that life too. Sometimes I still do. But I've learned that healing isn't going back and rewriting the life I already lived. It's deciding what I want to do with the life I still have. And I still do have a life. I don't want to grieve for the life I miss to steal the life that I have today. Ironically, it was my children who became the catalyst for my own journey. When they stopped attending meetings as young adults, I wanted to understand why. Listening to them forced me to face questions that I had buried for decades. What I once feared would tear my family apart became the beginning of discovering who I really was. I'm still learning. I'm still growing. And I'm still searching wherever that evidence leads me. Today, I consider myself a Christian, but my faith is no longer built on having certainty about everything. I try to follow the teachings of Jesus as best I can, to love others, to show compassion, to extend mercy, to have empathy for people whose experiences may be different from my own, and to keep learning with humility. I've become more comfortable saying, I don't know, because there was a time when those words scared me, but now they feel honest. If tomorrow I learn something that changes my understanding, I want to be willing to change my mind, because truth has nothing to fear from honest questions. One of the greatest surprises of this journey has been discovering a strength I never knew I possessed. I never believed that I could endure losing relationships with people I deeply loved. There were times I didn't think I could, but I did. Not because I was fearless, not because I didn't hurt, and not because suffering automatically makes someone stronger. I survived because each day, somehow, I took one more step, and then another. And I'm proud of myself for that. Not because I handled everything perfectly. I didn't, trust me. I'm proud because I made it through something I once believed would destroy me. Do I still grieve? Absolutely. Some of the relationships I lost are still lost. Some may never be what they once were. There are days when I miss my family more than words can express. Sometimes grief returns through a memory, a conversation, or a family event. It can still catch me by surprise. I don't know whether that part of my heart will ever completely heal, but it no longer consumes me the way it once did. It no longer defines who I am. For a long time, I was so focused on everything I was losing, I couldn't see what I still had. I had my husband. I had my children, my grandchildren. I had people who loved me. I still had a future, even if it wasn't the future I had expected. And eventually, I discovered something else. I still had me. I just hadn't met her yet. The woman underneath decades of expectations. The woman who could ask difficult questions. The woman who could examine evidence and reach her own conclusions. The woman who could change her mind when she learned something new. The woman who discovered that faith and honest questions can exist together. There was a time when I thought I knew exactly what my future would look like. Then I lost that certainty, and for a while, that terrified me. Now, I'm beginning to understand that not knowing exactly what comes doesn't mean there isn't something good ahead. If you're watching this while living through your own two griefs, grieving beliefs that once made you feel safe, and grieving people you thought would always be beside you, I want you to know something I couldn't believe when I was in the middle of mine. You won't always feel this lost. You won't always feel this afraid. Healing doesn't happen all at once. Sometimes you move forward for a while, and then something happens that makes you feel as though you have taken 2 steps backwards. But then, one day, you notice something. You're smiling again. You're making plans again. And you're beginning to recognize yourself again. Maybe not the person that you were before. Maybe someone you never had the chance to become. You may not get your old life back, but little by little, you can begin to build a new one. One that is truly your own. That's where this part of my story began. If you'd like to understand more about the night my relationships with my family began to change, I'll leave a link in the description to my video, My Family Shunned Me, the Night Everything Changed. If something in this video resonated with you, please make sure to like and subscribe. It helps this video be seen by more people, algorithms and all. Thank you for spending this time with me. As always, wherever your search leads, take care of yourselves and keep searching.